This video is my attempt to correct what I think is an injustice, the erasure and villainization of a man named George Westinghouse Jr., who I think was a decent and generous person, as well as being an incredibly important inventor. Now you might ask, how can I say all that about George Westinghouse? Didn't Westinghouse just take all his ideas from Nikola Tesla? And didn't he then convince the too generous Tesla to rip up a contract for royalties from polyphase current that was worth billions? And even worse, after his company was more solvent, didn't Westinghouse still refuse to support Tesla in his experiments to distribute electricity wirelessly throughout the globe? I mean, just imagine what Tesla could have discovered if he wasn't hampered by this altruistic act towards the greedy and selfish Westinghouse. I mean, that's what I thought, and I'm not alone. That has been repeated in an early biography of Tesla and basically every article and book about Tesla ever since. This is not a fringe idea. This is mainstream history. I mean, just check out this PBS video.
Westinghouse asked Tesla to rescind the royalty clause in the contract. Without consulting a lawyer, without hesitating, Tesla agreed.
Tesla does not try to negotiate, okay, we'll move it down from $2.50. I'll take 10 cents on the dollar. No, he doesn't negotiate at all. He simply tears up the contract. Their contract was really very, very generous. $2.50 for every horsepower of electricity produced. It would have made Tesla one of the richest men in history.
Then I found this letter to the editor from Tesla about Westinghouse, and it shocked me to my core. Here's what it said, quote, "Westinghouse is one of those few men who conscientiously respects intellectual property and who acquire their rights to use innovations by fair and equitable means. Had any other industrial firms and manufacturers been as just and liberal as Mr. Westinghouse, I would have had many more of my inventions in use than I have now." It sure didn't sound like Tesla felt that Westinghouse had swindled him. In fact, it sounded the exact opposite. But I thought, well, maybe the story was still true and Tesla took a little while to appreciate what had been done to him. But then I found a business announcement and I realized that the story just wasn't true. See, in 1897, Westinghouse and now Edison Free GE decided to share each other's patents. So they published a legal article to announce that on April 2nd, 1896, Westinghouse had purchased outright for $216,600 the Tesla patents for multi-phase current motors in order that both companies might manufacture apparatus covered by those payments without the payment of royalties. Let me repeat, in 1896, Westinghouse paid Tesla a large lump sum so that Westinghouse and GE could use Tesla's patents without the payment of royalties. If Tesla was paid a lump sum for his royalties in 1896, it was impossible that he ripped up a contract for those royalties in 1891. I also realized that Nikola Tesla, who lived till he was 86 years old and wrote many articles and an autobiography, never, as far as I can tell, not once told this story. I really can't help but come to the conclusion that this story just wasn't true. But if this story wasn't true, then I think we can take Tesla's comments from 1900 to heart. Westinghouse wasn't a greedy financier who stole from everyone. Instead, he was an incredibly generous inventor who had an astonishing impact on the development of technology. And that is a story that I think deserves to be told. So in this video, I want to go over the real story of who Westinghouse was, how he became a wealthy industrialist, because he definitely was a wealthy industrialist, and how he had so much influence on the development of alternating current electricity. Ready to have your mind blown? Let's go!
Electricity.
of the first things that surprised me about Westinghouse was that he wasn't born from an ultra-wealthy family, and instead became a wealthy industrialist out of his own creativity. See, Westinghouse had formed his first company when he was just 20 years old to promote a device that he had invented to help derailed trains get back on track, that he called a frog as it hopped from track to track. This company became very profitable, especially after he convinced a man named Commodore Vanderbilt, the patriarch of the Vanderbilt family, to purchase a whole lot of them. However, Westinghouse couldn't get the company or Vanderbilt to be interested in his other idea of air brakes. So in 1869, the now 22-year-old Westinghouse found a wealthy friend who helped him form a new company, the Westinghouse Air Brake Company. Both of these companies were unmitigated successes, especially the Air Brake Company. According to a Westinghouse biographer, by 1881, the Westinghouse Air Brake Company was the largest international manufacturing enterprise in the world. From the very beginning, Westinghouse insisted on fair pay, or even better than fair pay, for his employees. For example, in 1877, the rail workers in Pittsburgh averaged between $5 and $6 a week, while Westinghouse Air Brake employees averaged $4 a day. Considering that Westinghouse insisted on 9-hour workdays and half days on Saturdays, instead of the typical 10 to 12 hours, 6 to 7 days a week, Westinghouse's employees made more than 5 times the pay per hour than the abused rail workers. Years later, the legendary labor leader and president of the American Federation of Labor, named Samuel Gompers, said, "I will say this for George Westinghouse. If all employers of men treated their employees with the same consideration he does, the American Federation of Labor would have to go out of existence." After going to see the Centennial exhibit in Philadelphia in 1876, Westinghouse learned a lot about electricity and decided it would be a great idea to electrify train signals to make them safer. However, he couldn't get any of his companies or anyone else interested. So in 1881, he put up his own money and his own house as collateral to start a new company called the Union Switch and Signal Company.
The railroads weren't too interested in it. It was a safety issue, they weren't really, just like the brakes. They didn't come on stream with that. It wasn't, Westinghouse sort of pushed that. He saw a need.
Years later, a railroad operator said, "If the men who work the railroads ever chose a patron saint, it would be St. George, in honor of George Westinghouse." Now, I want to talk a little bit about how George Westinghouse got into the natural gas business for 2 reasons. One, it illustrates his and his wife's character, which I always find interesting. And 2, his solution for transmitting high-pressure gas made him more receptive to the idea of transmitting high-voltage AC current. In 1883, Westinghouse read in the paper that natural gas was found in Murrayville, a Pittsburgh suburb. According to a biographer, George's wife, Marguerite, teased her husband that he would soon get just as obsessed with natural gas as he had been with brakes, saying, "The brakes had one advantage over gas. You could always work out your problems at home instead of running off to Murraysville every day." George told her not to worry, saying, "I can work out my problems at home just the same. That is, if you don't mind me boring a well through your flower beds." And that's exactly what George Westinghouse did, except he drilled behind the stables of their house that they nicknamed Solitude. After 3 weeks of drilling, on May 29th, 1884, that nickname became ironic when Westinghouse team found a natural gas well that blew the top off the drilling machine with an infernal violence of a volcano. A visitor recalled that for days you couldn't hear your own voice. Everyone was up in arms about it. Everyone except George and Marguerite Westinghouse. George, according to the same visitor, had a never-disappearing smile on his beaming face, even while the fire department was pumping water over the house to prevent it from catching fire from the burning gas. When Marguerite came to investigate with a newborn on her hip, George asked her if she was satisfied with the experiment, and she cheekily replied, that she was quite happy, especially as the house still has a roof on it and the kitchen isn't wrecked. George Westinghouse was delighted to find this new way to provide light and heat to the people of Pittsburgh, and it was so much safer than coal. So he started a new company. However, there was one major problem with it. It was terribly flammable. So Westinghouse turned his interest once again to safety. And within 2 years, he had filed over 30 patents on natural gas safety and transfer, which was helped by his background in air pressure valves for his brake systems. One of the problems that Westinghouse dealt with was the best way to transmit natural gas was at high pressure. But that was very dangerous and had a tendency to leak. His ingenious solution was to place a high-pressure pipe inside another pipe with low-pressure gas. That way, any leakage in the high-pressure pipe would just steep into the low-pressure area and not into the ground, or worse, into the air. Luckily, the customer needed the gas from the safer low-pressure area, so none of this gas was wasted. He was in the middle of all that when he read an article about an international inventions exhibition that was held in London, and found an article by a French inventor named Lucien Gallard that would change Westinghouse's life. See, a few years before the London exhibition, Lucien Gallard was thinking about a certain kind of lamp called an arc lamp. Now, arc lamps work by heating up two carbon pieces so that they make a carbon gas and the carbon gas glows. And it was found that it works better on alternating current because both carbon rods burn at the same time. But there were so many different kinds of arc lamps, and each one was set up to work at different voltages. And Gallard was thinking that it was a shame that you couldn't just use one voltage for one and then change it and use another voltage for another. Then he started to think about a common device at the time called an induction coil or a Ruhmkorff coil that had two coils, so that a change in current in one coil would induce a higher voltage, lower current in the secondary coil, perfect for giving big shocks. Gallard then realized that he could use those two coils without the complicated electronics to transform the voltage from one voltage to another. Not only that, but Gallard also realized that he could use these two coils backwards, so he could transmit high voltage to low voltage, which was less dangerous. In other words, Gallard's brilliant leap was to produce AC at very high voltage and very low current, so that the power loss in the wires, which depends on the current squared, would be minimized. Then near the lamps, he used his device to transform the voltage to a safe level so that it would not harm the customers. Note that Gallard's idea only worked with alternating current because these two coils use something called the magnetoelectric effect, where the changing magnetic field from the first coil induces current in the second coil. With the financial backing of a man named Gibbs, Gallard patented what he called a secondary generator in 1880s, but it was quickly called a step-down transformer as it lowered the voltage in one step. This seemed completely logical to Westinghouse and parallel to how he transmitted high-pressure gas. He immediately cabled a low-level employee named Guido Pantaleone, who was in Italy for his father's funeral, and asked him to check it out. Pantaleone didn't have to travel far, as he reported that the system was already being used in Turin, Italy, and was successfully lighting buildings some 50 miles away from a waterfall-powered generator. However, Pantaleone remained skeptical, as the recently developed self-excited generators, or self-excited dynamos, couldn't be used with AC, and there were no AC motors. It seemed to most scientists at the time a step backwards to use alternating current for anything but arc lamps. Years later, Pantaleone recalled, "Werner von Siemens, who was the creator of the Siemens company, who I had known, assured me there was nothing whatsoever in alternating current. It was pure humbug." Despite this, Westinghouse was sold and quickly purchased a Siemens AC generator that was used for arc lamps, two Gallard and Gibbs transformers, and the services of an employee of Gallard and Gibbs named Reginald Belfield. When Belfield arrived in Pittsburgh, Westinghouse was surprised to find that despite the fact that Gallard had described the coils in his device as being similar to those of a simplified Ruhmkorff coil, they were actually composed of soldered discs stacked on top of each other. According to an early biographer who knew all the people involved, Westinghouse applied himself towards the production of a piece of apparatus that could be wound on a lathe, discarding the unpractical soldered joints and stamped copper discs of the Gallard-Gibbs transformer for the more commercial form of ordinary insulated copper wire. And it was then a question of only a few days before he had evolved the essentials of a modern transformer. All in all, according to this biographer, if you took all the time to study the device, it took Westinghouse only 3 weeks to work out those leading features of mechanical design, which have been the standard ever since. Still, despite their successes, everyone in the laboratory, with the possible exemption of Belfield, the engineer who they hired from Gallard, and a man named William Stanley, who they had hired for his light bulb patent, still believed that Westinghouse was on a fool's errand. Years later, Pantaleone recalled, "The opposition by all the electric part of the Westinghouse organization was such that it was only Mr. George Westinghouse's personal will that put it through." By December 1885, William Stanley convinced George Westinghouse to let him try a soft opening in a small town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where Stanley had gone on vacation as a child. Meanwhile, on January 8, 1886, 38-year-old Westinghouse started the Westinghouse Electric Company, his 5th company. And he also sent Pantaleone back to Italy to get the patent rights for the Gallard-Gibbs transformer. When Pantaleone asked for the price range, Westinghouse scoffed, "They'll tell you their price, whatever it is, close the bargain, and I'll send the money by cable to you." Gallard and Gibbs ended up asking for $50,000, equivalent to $1.4 million today, and he happily complied. Meanwhile, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, Stanley and Belfield spent 3 months working on their AC system and displayed it on March 20th, 1886. They kept the details of their device secret. They even went as far as hiding their transformers in the basement, but they let it be known that they could electrify any building in town. Soon, Westinghouse's company had 4 to 5 times the contracts as Edison's people did. Still, Westinghouse didn't like newspapers and didn't make an announcement, so it took several months for Edison to hear about it. Then, in September of 1886, Stanley patented his transformer without mentioning Westinghouse's involvement. Westinghouse didn't object. Stanley's contract covered any of his inventions, and it seemed likely that Westinghouse didn't feel any need for any extra name recognition. However, this action ended up hurting Westinghouse 4 years later when Stanley tried to form his own AC company and asserted that he invented all parts of the transformer. Westinghouse knew how to write a contract, so this effort failed in the courts. However, history has usually given full credit to Stanley because of this duplicitous behavior. It was only a few weeks after Stanley patented his transformer that Edison realized that Westinghouse was creating an alternating current incandescent light bulb company and started to get very, very worried. Now, Edison had known about transformers since 1885, and he'd even bought a patent for it from a group called the ZBD Group, who had made a superior transformer than Gallard's, but slightly after Gallard. Anyway, he had a good patent, but he didn't want to use it because Edison was very worried about electricity, and he insisted that it had to be buried. And if you're going to bury AC electricity for long distances, the amount you save with the wire doesn't really compare with the amount you have to pay to dig it all up. So he wasn't interested. Once he learned about Westinghouse, he started to work himself up into a frenzy of worry. Part of it is that Edison misunderstood how AC works. See, he knew that alternating current is as powerful not as the maximum amount or the minimum amount, but the average amount, called the root mean squared. But he erroneously thought that the damage as far as the body was concerned was the distance from the top to the bottom, which means he basically thought it was 2.6 times more dangerous than it was. Also, he knew that the high voltage for the transmission lines were very, very high. For example, in reference to the numbers he got from Zipernowski, one of the inventors of the ZBD transformer, Edison remarked, "Why, Zip uses 2,000 volts AC. That's 4,000 volts. Holy Moses!" No wonder he decided that just as certain as death, Westinghouse will kill a customer within 6 months after he puts in a system of any size. Soon the battle of currents was on. To recap, Westinghouse was an incredibly generous, kind, and inventive person. And according to basically anyone who knew him at the time, he was the main architect of using AC electricity in incandescent light bulbs. That is why when Nikola Tesla wrote that Westinghouse was generous in 1900, he also wrote that, quote, "It is chiefly due to Mr. Westinghouse that we have the extensive introduction of alternating currents. For it was he who first understood its value and aided efforts of pioneers, of whom I may count myself one." So why isn't this story well known? And why is the false story so well known? That is, next time on The Lightning Tamers. If you want to know more, I'm happy to announce that my new book, The Lightning Tamers, is available, and it covers the deep dive history from the 1580s through the current war and beyond. And you can get it in paperback, hardback, ebook, and I'm working on an audiobook. Also, if you go to my website, www.kathylovesphysics.com, I have the script for this video with not only citations, but links on all the citations. So you can just click on it and go to the place on the internet where you can see the original documents for yourself. Also, if you've been waiting for my video on the history of quaternions and on Hamilton, I am working on that too. I am sorry, I have too many ideas and not enough time, but I will try to get it out as soon as possible. I probably will do the one on Tesla first, just because they go together. And then I'll do it. Promise. If you're really desperate for it, you can email me and I will email you the script because I don't want to make you wait too long. Okay, stay safe and curious, especially after he convinced Commodore Vanderbilt. I'm gonna get it. Vanderbilt. I've heard that word before. Okay, have a good day. Stay safe and curious, my friends. Oh goodness, hair.